Today I'm going to teach you how to build a lightsaber, at least how I like to do it. In this video I will do my very best to go over as much as possible when it comes to building a lightsaber. That means I'll be covering all the parts, tools, and equipment that you'll need to make one, as well as some tips, tricks, and other things to keep in mind during the process. I decided to use the Desert Wanderer by KR Sabers and Corband for this video tutorial. This is because my customer wanted a basic Proffie install, and I think that's a great setup for anyone just starting out with building lightsabers who still wants a top tier lightsaber. Although since this is a thin neck, it will be a bit more challenging. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that this video took me a very long time to make, so if you like it and want to see more, please like and subscribe so I can keep making them. With that, I hope you're ready to learn because this is one long and jam-packed video. So sit back, get ready to take some notes, and let's get started. So first I'm going to go over all the parts and electronics you're going to need for this lightsaber build. You can find each and every one of these at the Saber Armory, or you could go to Saber Bay, which is where you can also find ProffieBoard, Neopixel connectors, some speakers. But the Saber Armory is where you can find the Desert Wanderer. You can also go to Corband as well. I'm going to be putting links in the description to each of these stores that I mentioned. I'm also going to be putting links directly to the parts that I use, so feel free to just head down to the description to look at all that. I'm also going to have resources like the manuals that you're going to want to reference, along with different Amazon links to the different tools that I have here. I've got some tools here that's over 6 and 7 years old, so I don't exactly remember where I got them from. So the links are going to be to things that are very similar to what I have, if I can't find the exact one. Alright, so first up here we have the chassis. This is just a simple Eco chassis from the Saber Armory. It's for the ProffieBoard, and the difference between Proffie and CFX is mainly in terms of dimensions. So a CFX is wider than a ProffieBoard. ProffieBoard is a little bit skinnier. So when you have a chassis specifically for one board or another, they're not going to fit each other. So this fits specifically Proffie, will not fit a CFX. Likewise, a CFX chassis is not going to fit a Proffie. So that's something you need to keep in mind. Make sure you get the chassis that fits the soundboard that you want. Next up, we have two other parts for the chassis. It comes with the chassis. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about getting them separate or anything. It comes with the purchase of the chassis. You've got this guy right here, which is a Neopixel connector for the body area. That's what connects the top of the chassis to the bottom of the neck section, so you can remove the chassis. This one here, that's a little bit smaller. So you can see one's taller, one's smaller. The smaller one goes into the emitter. It holds the Neopixel connector up there. And for any chassis you get for any lightsaber, you're going to want to check to make sure it fits in the hilt itself, because sometimes the diameters can be a bit off, in which case you're going to want to sand it down a little bit, make some minor adjustments. Next we have these Neopixel connectors. These are the stock V3 Neopixel connectors. There are different variations. You can get ones without LEDs, you can get ones that have less LEDs, the Eco versions, or you can get just different connectors altogether that aren't from stock, but I like the stock V3s because they give you the most amount of LEDs on there, and it gives you a bunch of different options in the back. If you see here, it has a section for blade detection. It's got two different spots for data, and you can set it up in multiple ways. I'll be showing you the manual for that later, and you can also check out the manual for the stock V3s in the description of the video. And here is our soundboard. This is the Proffie 2.2. I tend to use ProffieBoards or CFX soundboards since those are the two top tier lightsaber soundboards that you can find. ProffieBoard I would say is a lot easier to solder to because the little solder pads have massive holes, so it's very easy to put them in. Very straightforward. There's no tiny solder pads at all like with the CFX. It's pretty well laid out, but I do like the CFX in terms of how you program it on the computer, because you just do it all on the SD card really easily. It's a bit more tricky to set this up on the computer at the moment. And it's also a little bit trickier to set up all the different blade styles and the different effects that you can have on here. And any kind of different special setups you want to do, it's a little bit trickier if you don't know how to code. There are tons of resources though that'll help you out, like the FET263 website, which is absolutely amazing. So ProffieBoard, incredibly good, very popular, and it's one of the best in the business. Now here we have the battery section. This is the battery, 18650 lithium ion battery. I got this from the Saber Armory as well. You can also get some from Saber Bay, the Custom Saber Shop, any of those places to get a good 18650 battery. I know there's different stipulations as to what a good battery for a lightsaber would be, but this is a good size. That's the standard for most of these Neopixel lightsabers, so I always just stick to this. And then here we have the battery tabs, the positive here, and then we have the negative. These come with the chassis as well, so you don't have to worry about getting these, but if for some reason it either doesn't come with it, or let's just say you make your own chassis, you can buy these at the Saber Armory, Saber Bay, all the same spots. You could also get them on Amazon. So pretty much anywhere you can get some battery tabs that fit your chassis. And another note, if you buy a chassis that doesn't come with battery contacts, you're always going to want to check to see what type they use. And you can kind of tell by the battery contact ports here. There are about 3 different standard ones that I can think of that have been used in the past for different chassis. I use one with a spring. I also use these sometimes. These are very nice because it keeps everything nice and small in chassis designing. Everything is nice and compact. Now this is the kill switch. You don't necessarily need this in every lightsaber because you can just remove the battery, but it's very useful, very nice if you want to leave the battery in and if you just want to keep everything nice and safe. But again, you don't necessarily need it in a lightsaber build with a removable battery, but it's always a very nice feature to have. The last electronic part that we have is the speaker. This one is a 28mm speaker. You're going to want to check to make sure that whatever speaker you get for your lightsaber build will fit your lightsaber. This one is built specifically for a 28mm speaker, so 28mm speaker. I know sometimes, like with my last build, I built a Revan lightsaber. It said it was a 28mm speaker chassis, but it seemed to only fit 24mm. I don't know what was up with that, so I had to sand down the speaker chamber to fit the 28mm speaker. So you're always going to want to check to make sure everything fits before you start putting everything together. I tend to ignore that step since I build a lot of lightsabers. I kind of just assume that they all fit, which is not great, so always make sure they fit before you start installing everything, or else it's just going to be annoying. And I guess I'll give a note on the type of speaker. This is a 28mm speaker from Smuggler's Outpost. They make one of the best, if not the best speakers, just in terms of how they sound, because I've tested quite a few speakers, and I think I like the way that these ones sound the best. But any 28mm speaker will work. Okay, I'm filming this a bit late, but I forgot to add these into the parts list. These are 2 red tactile switches. You're going to want to get them from the Saber Armory or the Saber Bay. The link will be in the description. This is another part you're going to need. I'm adding this in later because, like with the buttons, I forgot to add this to my initial parts list. This is called a blade side connector. It's going to be going on the bottom side of the neck section inside the grip, right under here. Now I'm going to go over all the different tools that you might need. Some of them are necessary, some of them are not necessary, but I'll be going over each one individually, so I'll show you what you may need. Now, one of the most important things you're going to have that you can't skip out on is solder. I have 6040 rosin core solder that I bought 7 or 8 years ago now. Haven't run out. I bought it at a Radio Shack before they all shut down. You can see that right there. But yeah, as you can see, I've made a bunch of lightsabers and I haven't even gone through half of it yet. So all you need is one good purchase of solder and you're never going to need to replace it again. The reason I have the rosin core solder is because on the inside of this solder is flux, which allows the solder to flow a lot easier on the solder pads and just makes everything look a lot cleaner. And here we move on to 2 more things that I consider to be absolutely necessary. One is wire strippers that go from 20 gauge to 30 gauge. It's kind of tricky to find some of these. I tried to go to a lot of different stores many years ago. These are the same ones I've had since I started like 6-7 years ago making my first one. But you definitely need one that goes all the way up to 30 gauge wire because that is going to be the smallest wire that I use. And these are also incredibly useful because you can use this part to cut the wire. You can use each one of these to strip the wire. It's just invaluable as a tool. And here are some tweezers. You're going to want to get a set of tweezers. I only have this one that I've had for maybe 7 years now. And as you can see, they're really bent, old. They don't really grip very well. But you're going to want a bunch of these to help you out with just grabbing all the tiny little tools and wires, putting everything in place without using your hands. These are very important. Next, we have a soldering iron. Here we have a new soldering iron that I just got. My girlfriend got it for me for Christmas, I believe. And this is actually only the 3rd soldering iron I've ever had. The first 2 were $8, $10 ones on Amazon. It did its job, so I never felt like replacing them, but it's definitely helpful to be able to control the temperature by hand here. Plus, it also heats up a lot faster than my old ones. Along with your soldering iron, even if you don't get this exact one, you're going to want to get brass wool. This brass wool here is vital to keeping your soldering iron as healthy as possible, and you're going to want to just do this every time you do some soldering, just to clean the tip a little bit. My first soldering iron ever broke because it gave me a sponge that I had to wet and then use it to clean the tip. Never do that. It completely ruins the soldering iron. So just use brass wool and you're going to be fine. Now we move on to glue. You're going to want to have E6000. I found that this is incredibly helpful with gluing things down, not permanently, very easy to remove the glue while maintaining a really strong bond once it cures. The downside is that it takes forever to actually cure, so you need to hold the parts down and wait for it to cure. When using Loctite and super glue, you need to be very careful. You kind of need to know where you're gluing, how much you're gluing, just to be incredibly careful, because I've broken many buttons, many spring-loaded pins, and just caused a lot of trouble from using super glue. So the upside of using super glue is that it holds something really quickly. You don't have to wait a long time for them to stay, but that's also the downside, because if you mess up, you're going to break something. It's going to be really annoying to replace, and the glue is not easy to remove. And now we'll move on to the last things that I consider to be essential. This guy here is a small hobby vise. It doesn't really secure itself to the ground very well. It's supposed to do some sort of suction cup thing, but I've never actually gotten that to work, so I just keep it here and make sure I don't knock it over. But what this is useful for is holding everything in place. You can put your speaker in here, you can put your Neopixel connector in here. I like to put the Neopixel connector in here so I can put the pins on it, and then it also holds it in place for when I have to put the wires on. The other holding device are these helping hands. As you can see, I have added little alligator clips that have no teeth, because the teeth are going to be damaging the wires or any parts that you have in it, so the no teeth ones are essential. So if you have these two holding devices, you should be absolutely set. You can use one to hold the part and the other one to hold the wire, and all you have to do is put some solder on it, and it's all perfect. You'll be able to see how I use them when I build the lightsaber. We're on to another essential thing you should have, heat shrink. I have a whole variety pack here. I only really use the really small ones, or sometimes these bigger ones here, but I never use the large ones. But definitely have an assortment of heat shrink. And here I have a bunch of wires. I used to have them in boxes, which is really annoying to use, so I decided to move them under my desk, and now it's really easy. I've got these ones here, and I also have these on the other side. You're going to want to get multiple colors of 22 gauge, 24 gauge, 28 gauge, and 30 gauge wire. There's going to be a wire gauge chart on the ProffieBoard manual, so you're going to want to refer to that whenever you have a question on what gauge you should use for what part, but I'm also going to tell you throughout the process. If you don't want to buy a bunch of extra wires you don't want to be using, I'll give you a list of which ones I use. For 22 gauge wire, I only use two colors, red and black, for the positive and negative power lines. For 24 gauge wire, it's also red and black for positive and negative. Now for the 28 and 30 gauge wire, I use all the different colors that came in the package. Red, green, yellow, blue, white, and black. This is because most parts, especially the extra features that I like to add, like the OLED display, Bluetooth, blade detection, etc., those all don't really need that much power. Most parts in the lightsaber actually only need 28 or 30 gauge wire. It just depends on what fits in your lightsaber, how much space you need, etc. But it's important to use the right wire gauge, or else you're going to be giving something too much power or too little power, and things aren't going to work appropriately. Now we have some not so necessary stuff that I think is extremely useful still. First up, we have some grease. This is going to be for all of the threading in your lightsaber. If it's too rough, you can just make it a lot smoother this way. There's some that squeak like crazy that's just really annoying, so grease, amazing. Next, a plain old pair of scissors. I use these most often to cut the battery tabs on the lightsaber chassis I design, but for most chassis you don't actually need to cut anything off of the battery tabs. And then we have some small wire cutters, and also some rubber bands. I use the rubber bands to hold the parts in place while the E6000 dries. You may also want to get some sanding sheets to sand down chassis or other parts. I also have different sizes of screwdrivers in case the hilts that I'm installing have some screws that need to be unscrewed. A flashlight can also be useful because there are some dark spots inside the hilt when you're installing everything. I forgot to mention, but a micro USB cable is essential for setting up the Proffie on your computer, along with a micro SD card reader. Now that we've gone over all the parts and tools that you might need, let's move on to installing the lightsaber. Okay, so I like to begin my lightsaber builds by having a look at the hilt itself, having a look at how it should be installed, what are used as the buttons, where the speaker's going to go, and generally how everything is going to get put together. So let's go ahead and take this apart and have a look. So from what it seems like, I can't really unscrew this grip section from the clamp. I'm not going to try any harder than that because you don't want to break anything. Next, I know that this neck section completely comes off, which is useful for when we set up the Neopixel connectors in the neck. The tricky part about thin neck lightsabers is the fact that you have to run wires through here without snapping them when you set the Neopixel connectors in place. I'll be showing you that later and how I get around it. You're always going to want to be careful when unscrewing these things, because sometimes if you grip onto them too hard and it's too hard to unscrew them, you can cut yourself. I've cut myself quite a few times on the Luke lightsabers, and these things can be really, really sharp, so just be careful. The Desert Wanderer lightsaber is very interesting because it has two sections to the emitter, this top part and then this base part. It also has a very unique blade plug retention system, since as you can see there are no retention screws here. if I can get it to focus. This blade plug actually gets held in place because this top section has a little lip. And when you screw it on, it just holds everything together, kind of like a sandwich. Okay, so I've been trying to unscrew the rest of this because I'm pretty sure each of these is a separate part, but for some reason it's not working, so I'm just not going to try and push it. If you wanted to, you can get yourself a vise and you can just clamp it in, make sure you put some towels or tape around it to make sure it doesn't get scratched up or anything, and then you can use something to help give you some torque to pull it open. But since it's not entirely necessary, I can get everything set up this way. I'm just going to leave it as it is. The bottom section also seems really stuck because I know that the pommel comes off, but for some reason I can't seem to get it off. I also don't have a vise with me. I'll need to buy that in the future. So I'm just going to leave it as it is because, again, it's not very necessary. This part does come undone though, which is good because this part is necessary to open up. There we go. Now I'm going to test the chassis to make sure everything fits. This is how I like to put the chassis into the lightsaber. Once everything is all functional, I like putting it in through the pommel. There we go. And as you can see, this little lip stops right there. And then the pommel cap goes right over it. Holds it in place, and it gives the speaker a really nice resonance chamber. This is one of the loudest lightsabers I've ever built. There we go. Now I just want to make sure it fits in here. Which it does. Okay. Fits in there. It's a little tight, but it works. There we go. And then the buttons, they can be pressed. The buttons go right here. And then I'm just going to test the rest of the chassis parts to make sure they fit. If they don't, I'll sand them down to make sure that they do. This part goes inside of the grip section here. There we go. You won't be able to see it. Maybe I'll get a flashlight here. Can you see it at all? We have the ring all the way at the bottom, so that works perfectly. Now we just got to test the emitter. There we go. Works great. Don't need to sand any of the chassis. Let's open up the speaker to make sure it fits in the chassis as well, because again, I had an issue with the previous lightsaber that I built, so you always want to test it. There we go. Fits perfectly. For the Neopixel connectors, I know they're not going to fit immediately because it has these little fin things. You're going to want to sand these down. Hold on, let me focus on it. There we go. So if you see, it's got these little frills here that you're going to want to sand down. You sand it down to just enough so it has some friction to hold it in place, or if you sand it down too much, you can always just glue it in place. It's just a bit looser, but the glue will secure it. Now I'm going to test the ProffieBoard to make sure it fits. There we go. Perfect fit. So I grabbed these red buttons because they're pretty standard sized, and I decided to put them into the button location. There you go, they fit perfectly right in these little spots. And then I put the chassis in. You want to put it in carefully because if you put it in a bit too fast, and let's just say the buttons are a bit too tall, these button press plunger things at the bottom are going to just snap the button, the tactile button underneath. It's going to break it completely. I've done that to quite a few buttons, which is very, very bad. So just be careful and feel it out. Make sure you don't have too much tension or anything, because if it is, you'll break the button. And if those are your only buttons, you're going to have to wait for another set. But as you can hear, it's the perfect size. You can hear a great click, and it's exactly where they need to be. So these buttons are the ones that I'm going to be using. If any of you have seen my other build videos, you might know that I like to start with the Neopixel connector. So that's what we're going to start with. A Neopixel thin neck lightsaber that has a removable chassis is separated into two main parts. You've got the top of the neck and the bottom of the neck. The top of the neck is the emitter, this is where the Neopixel goes, and it sits inside of this Neopixel holder. The second part is the bottom of the neck, which sits inside of the grip section here. It goes right on the underside, inside of here. The tricky and annoying part of setting up a thin neck lightsaber is the wire management. It can be pretty tricky to have the right length of wire in here, because if you have it too long, it doesn't fit, too short, and you can't solder to the Neopixel connector. So I'll be showing you how I set up a thin neck lightsaber. First, I like to set up the blade side connector, which goes inside of the handle on the underside of the neck. I have to first make sure that this one fits inside of its holder. Looks like it fits perfectly fine. Just snaps right in. Now this blade side connector is also made from Stock Custom Works, who made the Neopixel connector. This blade side connector comes with a resistor. You don't necessarily need it, but if you do want to add it, you can put it right here on the data spot. It should be bridging these two pads here. The reason why I say you don't necessarily need that resistor is because you only really need one resistor on the data line. And for most lightsabers, that data resistor actually exists inside of the blade itself. I don't remember what resistance this resistor has, but you can always check in the manual to see what you need. But I think it might be 330. If you take a closer look at the back side of the blade side connector, you can see it has a few different solder pads. You've got positive, negative, data, another negative, and another positive. You can see the positive is the outside circle, the data is right in the center, and the negative is right in between the positive and the data. That matches up to the other side, which is the data, negative, and positive rings. It is very important that you never mix up the positive and negatives. I've done that a few times and I've fried different components. It's very bad. I've probably fried almost every single part that you can possibly fry just because I accidentally swapped the positive and negative pads. So you're always going to want to make sure, double check, triple check that the positive and negatives are not swapped and they're in the right spot. So let's get started on cutting the right length of wire. So let's start by using two 22 gauge wire, one for the positive and one for the negative. What I like to do is either route the wire through the channel it's going to be in or go on the outside and just generally measure the length of it. Since it's pretty easy, I'm going to route it through for this one. So I'm going to have it stick out a little bit here, stick out a little bit up here as well. I'm going to give some extra space just in case. If you're not sure how much length you need, always err on the side of caution. Get a little bit more than you need. That way if you mess up, you always have some more length to work with. And then you just chop it generally where you need it. There you go. And since the positive and negative wire are going in the same place, I'm going to use the wire I just chopped to measure out the other wire. There we go. Now we need one more wire. That's going to be the data line. I'm going to use this 30 gauge green wire. After you've cut the wires to the length that you want, you're going to want to strip just enough to cover the solder pad. So if you compare it here, it's going to be just about that much. There you go. I tend to just eyeball these things though. Here you go. We have the 22 gauge negative wire in the wire strippers here. You just clamp it down and then you just pull it out and you've got the stripped wire. And you're going to want to do that for each one of these. Now to solder the wires to the connector, I'm going to use this little hobby vise that I showed you in the beginning. And actually for the data wire, you're going to want to strip a little bit more than necessary because you're going to want to connect these two separate pads. If you don't connect them, this isn't going to work. So I stripped the wire a little extra long so that I can cover both pads. For soldering, if you have something with an adjustable temperature, I like to set it to somewhere around this section, which I believe is 550 degrees Fahrenheit, about 275 degrees Celsius. You can adjust it however you'd like, but I find that anything up here is way too much for me. This is about the range that works really well. But I'm definitely not an expert on soldering, so don't take my word for it. This is just what works for me. So for your build, just find whatever melts the solder the best. So here I'm going to do what's called pre-tinning, where you put solder on the pads before you solder the wire to it. This just makes it so it's really easy to connect the wires later. The general idea with soldering is you want to heat the pad and put the solder to the soldering iron and it just melts to the pad. And since this is rosin core solder, the flux allows it to flow really smoothly. It doesn't really matter which pad you solder the positive and negative to, as long as the negative is on a negative pad and a positive is on the positive pad. You could either put them right next to each other or you could stagger them. I think for this build I'm going to solder all the wires to one side of the connector. Okay, so on top of pre-soldering the connector pads themselves, you're going to want to do the same to the exposed portion of the wires. So if you see here, I have some solder sticking out of the spool so I can easily pre-tin these wires. And then with both the connector and the wire pre-soldered, all you have to do is put the wire down and then just melt the solder together. And there you go. We'll do it for the positive and negative as well. There we go, snapped right in place, holds itself pretty nicely, but we're going to want to put some E6000 in there just to be safe. I also like to have some E6000 on the joints themselves, that way they're a bit stronger for when we have to twist everything in place. As I mentioned earlier, the tricky part of thin neck lightsabers is preventing any kind of snapping, so overall wire management is very important. So having the E6000 on the solder joints just helps prevent any kind of breaking. Of course this isn't going to completely stop it from breaking, but at least it'll make it a bit stronger so it's less likely to happen. We're also going to want to put some glue on this outer rim here so we can stick it on the inside of this grip section. There we go, you can see some glue there. Now let's just put it inside of the hilt. Okay, I got it in. As you can see, I kind of twisted these wires together a little bit, that way they all kind of stick together and you can thread it through small spaces a bit easier. But you definitely don't want to over twist it. I have done that in the past, and when we end up putting the rest of the neck on, it does put more tension on the solder joints, so you're going to want to kind of unwrap it. That way when we put the rest of the neck on, when we twist everything in place, it doesn't over twist. We're going to want to hold this connector in place while it cures, so I like to put the chassis inside of the hilt and then just put it all together. That way it kind of keeps pressure on it all. This chassis needs to be put in through the back, so I'm going to put on this back end, the booster, and the pommel section. And now we put on the chassis. There we go, and with everything in place, we now have enough pressure on the connector and the connector holder so that everything cures in place properly. Now let's just thread the wires through the neck and out the emitter. Seems like it's a bit tight of a fit, so I'm going to twist it again. What you can also do to keep the wires sticking together so you can thread it through a small space is you can put some tape on it. Just wrap the tips up here. There we go. That way they're all stuck together so you can thread it through. And see that? Makes it a lot easier. So for now I'm going to completely screw in the next section so we have as much wire sticking out to solder as possible. Now we once again pre-solder the exposed portion of the wires. Now I'm going to move on to setting up the Neopixel connector. Okay, as you can see, I've got the Neopixel connector manual on the screen right now. If we just have a look through here, I'll show you the wiring diagram. This will tell you everything you need to know about the Neopixel connector and different ways for data inputs. You have the V1, V2, V3, and V4. If you can see here, the V1 is only for the blade and has no PCB LEDs on the connector itself. I really like having LEDs on the Neopixel connector, so I never used a V1 setup. For V2, it's the blade and PCB LEDs in parallel. This is how the Neopixel connector comes standard. If I show you the Neopixel connector next to the image, we have two resistors here, and then these pads are not connected. Which is exactly what this one is, two resistors, and these two pads are not connected. Blade plus PCB LEDs in parallel essentially just means that the LEDs on the connector is just going to mimic the blade. With the V3 setup, the blade and the PCB LEDs are wired in series, which essentially mean that the LEDs on the connector act as the first 16 pixels of the blade length. The V3 setup allows you to have a little bit more flexibility in what happens with the 16 LEDs on the PCB itself. Now the most flexible setup is the V4, which has the blade and PCB LEDs wired independently. That means each of them is controlled by their own data line. Now as you can see, the differences between all of these setups is whether or not the resistors exist in the R1 and the R2 spot, and whether the D2 pads are connected or not. Since this is a removable chassis thin neck lightsaber and we're using the blade side PCB, we really only have one spot for a data, so that only allows us to use either V1, V2, or the V3 setup. For the emitter Neopixel at least. But for this build, I'm just going to leave it in the V2 setup, which is the one that it comes with. So now we have one of the more fun parts of each lightsaber build, putting the pins in the Neopixel connector. I kinda just like putting the pins on the floor next to the little vise that I have, and then I just pick it up with these tweezers to plop it in. Now that I have all the pins in their respective holes, I'm just going to lock them all in place with solder. When doing this, I found that the easiest way is to aim your soldering iron towards the pad that the pin is on, and it just melts the solder a lot easier. Just allows it to flow better. There you go. But sometimes you can't hit it, so it's perfectly fine if you aim for the top of the pin. The more you do it, the more you'll get used to it. Then I'm going to pre-solder the pads that we're putting the positive, negative, and data lines to. Now before we put this in the emitter and solder the wires to it, you just want to make sure that it fits inside of the Neopixel connector holder. And as you can see, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to sand down these little frills to make it fit. There we go. Now fits really nicely. Now the correct order of operations to do this is to put the Neopixel connector holder in over the wires and into the emitter first, and then solder the Neopixel connector to the wires. This seems self-explanatory, but I've messed this up so many times that I thought I'd mention it. It'll just save you the trouble of having to unsolder and resolder the connector. Here you can see I'm using the helping hands with the toothless alligator clips, and I'll just adjust the height here so the wires go to where I need them. And then I'll use my tweezers to move the wires onto the pad when I solder. And now we have all the wires soldered in place. Now we're getting closer to the scary part. Let's take the Neopixel connector holder, pull it up, and then put the Neopixel connector in it. And I'm going to add some E6000 to the connector and to the bottom of the holder so that it all holds in place at the bottom of the emitter. You definitely don't need to use as much E6000 as I do, but I like to do it just to make everything really secure. I still have nightmares about setting up thin neck lightsabers where the wire snaps and I have to redo everything multiple times. Now the tricky part is to put the Neopixel connector at the bottom of the emitter while having all the wires in the neck section. The way I like to do that is straighten out the Neopixel connector that we just glued and then unscrew the neck. Once the neck is all the way unscrewed, pull it up and push the Neopixel connector down into the bottom of the emitter. This makes it so that the wires don't clump up underneath the Neopixel connector and underneath the holder, and it is just existing inside of the neck itself. Now you're going to want to maintain pressure downwards on the Neopixel connector as you push the rest of the neck down and re-screw it in place. Make sure that you do this very slowly and methodically. I don't like to screw it in place too quickly because I feel like it puts unnecessary pressure on the wires and the solder joints. Plus, when you go slowly, you can feel if anything snaps on the inside. And there we go, screwed all the way in. I don't think I felt any snaps happen. It actually felt really smooth. So the next thing you're going to want to do is make sure to hold the Neopixel connector and the holder completely still so that the E6000 can cure. I like to do this by putting in the blade plug and then making sure that is secure, and it just maintains pressure on all of it while it cures. And with that, we're done with the emitter and neck section. So now we just have to wait for the E6000 to cure in the emitter and the blade side PCB. And since we used the chassis to hold the blade side PCB in place while it cures, we can't really install anything in the chassis for the time being. So for now, while we wait, I'm going to set up the other Neopixel connector that's going to go on the top of the chassis. Now with the chassis Neopixel connector, you can actually set it up in any of the various ways that I showed you on the manual. So for me, a lot of the time I like to set it up in the V4 formation with the 2 data lines. I also like adding the blade detection wire, which goes right here. But once again, this is just a basic Proffie build, no extra features, so we're just going to leave it in the V2 formation. Without the chassis, it's a bit harder to measure exactly how much wire I need to cut, so I'm just going to leave it as it is, wait for it to cure, and then I'll be right back. Okay, I am back. It is now a few hours later, and I believe this should be cured enough for me to remove the holds from it, so let's remove the chassis. Oh right, if I remember correctly. Oh, we're going to need to grease this up. Like I mentioned earlier, some of these hilts need greasing, or else it's going to squeak like crazy. The chassis is now out, now we can get to work on cutting the wires to size. So since I'm setting up the Neopixel connector first, I cut all the wires to size. I have 2 24 gauge negative wires, 1 30 gauge data line, and I have 1 22 gauge positive line that'll get connected directly to the positive tab for the battery. So to cut the wire, I basically just did what I showed earlier in this video, where I route the wire through where it's going to be. This is going to connect to the soundboard over here, and it's going to come out to the Neopixel connector on this side. The reason why I have two 24 gauge negative wires is because on the ProffieBoard there are 2 spots to put the negative wires of the Neopixel connector. On the Crystal Focus soundboard there's 4 slots, so typically I take two 24 gauge negative wires and then I split them at the end into 4 total. 2 on this side and 2 on this side. So you can either have two 24 gauge wires like I have here, or one 22 gauge wire and you split it off at the end to connect to the ProffieBoard. I'm going to quickly show you the ProffieBoard wiring diagram that I'm going to be using, and it's a good reference for you guys for when you set up your own lightsaber. So here's the ProffieBoard wiring diagram that I'm using. You can set it up in multiple different configurations. You can just go through each one of these, and then you can set it up, and it'll tell you how you should wire it to the ProffieBoard. It'll also set you up with a basic config file that you can use. For now, let's just have a look at this wiring diagram. I set it up with a kill switch like we have in our build here. You should be able to get a good basic understanding on why I chose the amount of wires I chose and how I'm routing everything in the chassis itself. For our build, this is the Neopixel connector. As you can see, the positive line is going to go straight to the kill switch, and then the kill switch is going to go to the soundboard. And then the 18650 lithium-ion battery, the positive to that, goes straight to the kill switch, and it connects with the positive from the Neopixel connector. So what I'm doing is setting up the positive of the Neopixel connector to go straight to the positive of the battery, and then I'm going to have the line from the battery go straight to the kill switch. What you could also do is set the positive of the battery going straight to the Neopixel connector, and then having a line from the Neopixel connector go to the kill switch. Both ways work. And here you can see what I was talking about from the negatives of the Neopixel connector. This is if you have one 22 gauge wire and split it off to connect it to the soundboard. What I'm doing is I have the Neopixel connector with two 24 gauge wires, so I don't have to split it at all. They just go to their own respective spots. And here you can see where you set up the speaker. You've got your activation switch and your auxiliary switch. This is showing that you connect the 2 ground wires from the buttons. I'll be showing you how to do that later. Ignore the recharge port, we don't have it in our build, but I can't remove it from this configurator. So the negative from the battery goes straight to the negative on the board. If you see here, I like to have one spot for the button negative and one spot for the battery negative. It doesn't really matter since they're connected, but it's just easier this way so I don't have to connect them outside. This shows you where the data line goes, and it also shows you where the positive wire goes. So yeah, this is a great resource showing you where to wire everything. This just makes it really easy to comprehend and set up. And of course, the ProffieBoard manual will tell you exactly what each of these pads do. Now we're back to the Neopixel connector. For now, I'm just going to set up the 2 negative wires and the data line. Strip the wire. More wire stripping. And I'm once again going to be pre-tinning these wires. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but these 2 spots here are your negative pads right in between your 3 pins that you soldered. If you end up stripping a little bit too much of your wire, you can always cut it down with your wire trimmers. It's a good idea to keep the stripped part of your wire small enough so it doesn't stick out of the solder pad and hit something else. I have a habit of twisting the wires together when I'm done. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. But at the very least it should be able to reduce a bit of strain on each of these joints, especially this 30 gauge wire. When routing your wires, you always want to think about the best ways to conserve space in your chassis, especially if it has as little space for wires underneath the board as this one does. So what I like to do is put the soundboard where it's going to be. In this case, I have the micro USB port facing the speaker because this is how you're going to access and plug things in. You've got all this empty space over here. And the SD card I have on bottom because you won't be accessing that as much as you will the micro USB port. So from the wiring diagram, you can see that these 2 pins are the negatives of the Neopixel connector, and then one over here is the data. So with that in mind, you're going to want to route the wires from the Neopixel connector on this side of the chassis. There we go. Wires are routed in the correct location. Wire management is going to be incredibly important when you have something like this that has kind of cramped spaces, and also when you start adding a bunch of extra features like the OLED display and Bluetooth. The more wires you have, the more important wire management will be. And once again, as you guys can see, this doesn't quite fit, so we're going to sand it down. And now remember, before we glue this, we still have to set up the positive wire. So next I'm going to show you guys how to set up the battery tabs and the kill switch. So first you want to make sure that the battery tabs fit where they're supposed to, so let's put this positive in. And as you can see, it sticks up a little bit too much. So what I'm going to end up doing is cutting the little tab off the bottom. And I'm actually going to do the same thing with the negative contact. The next thing I like to check is to see which side of the battery tab I can solder the wire to. And what determines that is the space in the chassis itself. As you can see, you have a little bit of gap on the front of the battery tab section, and you also have a little space on the back. And in my builds, I like to try and hide as many wires as possible, so with this one, I'm going to try soldering the wires to the back side of each of the contacts. Alright, so here I have the wires that I'm going to be connecting to the battery contacts. As you can see, I have 2 positive wires, like I mentioned before, and then 1 negative wire. All of them are 22 gauge. This positive wire is going to be going from the battery contact to the Neopixel connector, and this one is going from the battery contact to the soundboard. And once again, to get these lengths of wire, I ran them through the chassis or just estimated where they would be, and then cut them to size. To make soldering the wire to the contact a little bit easier, I'm going to solder them together now and then connect it to the contact later. So for this chassis, when you're routing the wires, you have a little channel here at the back. This is what allows me to have the wire on the back side of the contact, since this little piece that holds everything together is very close to the back. It barely leaves enough room for the wire, which is why the channel is there. And sometimes you'll need a little extra help, so I like to use the back end of my tweezers to push things down. And then this is where the wire sticks out, so you just push it right back through the chassis, and there we go. It comes out right where you need it to attach it to the board. There we are. We're going to glue this down later with some E6000. What's nice about this chassis is it has this little cutout here. I'm not exactly sure what it's useful for. I imagine you could put an LED there, maybe a little plate to diffuse the light, sort of as a faux crystal chamber maybe. But I think mainly what its purpose is to allow you to reach inside and get the wires that you need. So now we have the 2 battery tabs set exactly where they're going to need to be. Now let's work on the kill switch. As you already know, this wire is connected to both the battery and the Neopixel connector. So we already have this 1 positive wire that's going to be going to one of these outer pins. Now all we need is 1 wire that goes to this middle pin that'll go all the way to the board. And once again, the positive wire is going to be this 22 gauge wire that I cut to length. Since I have all this extra wire here, I'm going to cut it to right about here, which is all I'm going to need to solder to the kill switch. Since these little prongs are so thin and stick out so much, they are liable to being bent and then touching each other. You don't want that, or else it's not going to be any use. So sometimes what I do after I solder the wire to the 2 legs is cut off the extra leg and then bend these ones away from each other so they're less likely to touch. Now that is something that you probably shouldn't do, and it's much easier if you just use heat shrink. My logic with my other method is that there's typically not much space past the little legs in the chassis, so when you set up the wire and heat shrink, it prevents the wires from bending enough to put the kill switch in all the way. And I figure in most chassis, the battery tab, the wire, and the kill switch are in a space where there's not going to be any tension put on the wire, so the joints really aren't at risk of touching each other or moving. So now that you know the pros and cons of both methods, you can do whichever one you think is best for you. But for this particular build, since you have so much space back there, I highly recommend using heat shrink. There are no excuses not to. And before we solder on the wire from the chassis, you're going to want to put the heat shrink over it, because you won't have another chance otherwise. So I'm going to show you how I shrink the heat shrink with my soldering iron. You're pretty much just going to want to use this portion of the tip of your soldering iron, not the soldered section, because it's going to leave some behind on the heat shrink. I like to try and roll the heat shrink as much as I can. And there you have it, heat shrinked solder joints. Now we just have to push the kill switch into its spot. And this is what the inside looks like after I've routed the wires. You're going to want to make sure the kill switch is flat against the wall here, because with this chassis design it has this open side, which allows it to stick out a little bit sometimes. So what I'm going to do is make sure it's flat, put some E6000 on it, then it won't be moving. Let's go back to the positive wire going to our Neopixel connector. Looks like we can cut off a little extra wire, so let's do that. Then we can strip it. Now we can pre-tin it. And now we put some solder on the positive pad. And as you can see, I'm using these helping hands and my tweezers to help put the wire exactly where I need it to be to solder it perfectly. And there we have it. We have the Neopixel connector all set up, the battery tabs, and the kill switch. Eventually I'm going to be using E6000 to secure everything in place, but for now, let's move on to the speaker. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this is a Smuggler's Outpost 28mm bass speaker. As far as I know, pretty much all speakers are set up the same, where it has these two solder pads on either side. So technically one of these is a positive and one of these is a negative, but it doesn't matter which one is which as long as they're separate from each other. That's the nice part about speakers, you don't have to worry about which side is which. With speakers, I like to use either 28 or 30 gauge wire. It doesn't really matter which one you use, but 30 gauge is normally good for if you have tight spaces in a chassis, but since we have so much space, might as well use 28 gauge. 28 gauge wire is just a little bit nicer to use than 30 gauge. 30 gauge likes to snap sometimes. And 28 gauge, of course, is a little bit less likely to snap. So it doesn't really matter what color your speaker wires are. I'm using black right now, but I've used blue in the past, and I've used other colors as well. But like for most parts in your lightsaber build, as long as you know what wire it is and what part it's for, it doesn't really matter what color you use. And I think you guys have already guessed, we're going to add some solder to these pads. Okay, the speaker is all set up, the wires reach where they need to be, and before I put it in place, I'm going to be putting E6000 on everything, especially the kill switch, to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, and then we can move on to wiring up the buttons. To help hold the positive tab in place while the glue is curing, I actually have this really cool battery placement holder thing. I got the STL file from Saber and I put this crystal in myself. It's just a pretty fun thing to put in the battery section when the battery's not in place, but I actually found that this is really helpful to hold the battery tab in place while the glue is curing. But since this negative isn't a spring, sometimes the battery can be a bit loose, so what I like to do is put some pliers or tweezers under here and just pull the tab a little bit up and just bend the metal. There you go, it sticks out a little bit more. This is actually a little bit smaller in length than a battery, so sometimes I unscrew the bottom just to make it a little bit taller. There we go, and that should be holding the positive tab in place while it cures. Let's move on to the two red buttons I'm going to be using. As you can see, there's 4 legs to each button. Now one of these legs is going to be the positive and one's going to be the negative. The only rule you're going to need to keep in mind with these buttons is that this one and this one are connected, and then this one and this one are connected. You can tell by looking at the bottom side, it'll have a little pathway, just a little ridge. So what that means is you're not going to want to have a positive and a negative on the same side, since it's not going to allow it to work. So you're either going to need to have the positive here and the negative on the opposite corner, but the easiest way is to have a positive and a negative on the same side, but not along this length where they're connected. You'll be able to tell a lot easier in person. You can actually tell a little bit which side is which. These two are the sides that are not connected to each other, while these two are connected to each other. So you're going to want to have the positive and negative on this side. Or, like I mentioned before, positive on this side and then negative on one corner. That's also one possibility. So now let's pre-tin the legs. As for which gauge of wire you're going to be using, I either use 28 or 30 gauge. If I don't need 30 gauge, I'm going to use 28 gauge, because like I mentioned before, 30 likes to snap a little bit easier than 28. And with this chassis, with all the space we have, you don't need 30 gauge wires. And here are the wires for the buttons. I measured them out and cut them to length. Now we're just going to strip them and then pre-tin them. Since the legs on the buttons are a bit small, you're going to want to pay a little bit more attention to how much wire you strip, because if you do too much, it's more liable to snap. If you do too little, it's not going to hold on enough. So these are the buttons on the Desert Wanderer. I tend to like to have the bigger button be the activation, while the smaller button is the auxiliary, but you can just choose which one you like better. And ultimately it doesn't matter which one of these buttons you use for which, because you can always just switch it in the config file. I like to use a yellow wire to indicate the activation button, and a green wire to indicate the auxiliary button. So you can use E6000 to glue down the buttons, but I tend to use Loctite because when you use E6000 you need to hold these in place using a rubber band, and depending on where it is in the chassis, that can be a bit difficult. The thing about Loctite is it can be a bit risky, because if you use too much it can seep into the button and prevent it from working and permanently break it. So if you do decide to use Loctite, make sure you know what you're doing and you use the right amount, and you only do it once, maybe twice maximum if you mess up. Because with Loctite, if you mess up and have to redo it, it leaves behind residue in these little spots, pushing the button a little bit higher than it should be, and sometimes it runs into the plungers of the button of the hilt, and it can break the button top. We now have all the parts wired up and glued where they're going to be in the chassis. Now, we just have to prep these wires to solder to the soundboard. So for right now, I'm just going to go through and cut each one of these wires to the appropriate length for where they're going to be soldered to the soundboard. I also like to take this time to connect any wires that need to be connected before they reach the soundboard. For this build, we only have one set of wires that need to be connected before they reach the soundboard, and that would be the two negatives from the buttons. Okay, with all these wires cut to the right length, I'm going to show you how I connect wires into a single wire. First, I'm going to cut both of them to roughly the same length. And then I'm going to strip a good amount of them. As you can see, I'm using the helping hands to help put these together so I can solder them. And now we're going to take the single wire that we're going to solder the two wires to, strip it, and then solder it right to them. Make sure you pre-tin it as much as you can. With all of this exposed, you're going to want to use some heat shrink to cover it up. I'm just going to cut this wire to be a little bit smaller. Now we have all of the wires cut to the length we want them at. I'm going to strip each one of these and make sure you do not pre-tin these wires. I'm going to repeat that. Don't pre-tin these. That's going to be incredibly useful, especially if you're wiring up to a CFX soundboard. Proffie is a lot more forgiving because they have massive holes on the solder pads, but on CFX boards those holes are really tiny, and on one of them, the LS2, is really tiny. So if you add any solder to it, it's going to be too fat and it won't fit. So for this one, we just strip them, do not pre-tin them, we put them into the solder pad hole, and then solder straight onto there. I was told sometime, somewhere, I don't really remember, that you don't want to solder with the SD card in, so make sure you take that out before you do any soldering. Feel free to solder the wires on in any order you like, it doesn't really matter, whichever you think is going to be easiest for you. And I don't like doing all of them at once, I do only a couple at a time. And there we go. All the wires have been soldered in place. And if you've managed the wires correctly, you should be able to just push it all down, and then it'll just hold in place. You may end up using a little bit of Loctite in the corners, or you could use Captain tape, either one to hold it in place. But if you opt with one of the more permanent solutions, it's a bit harder to access the micro SD card and the micro USB port. Although that shouldn't be too bad of an issue, because you could just use a 90-degree angle micro USB and access the micro SD card by taking out the battery. So if we take a look here and take out this battery holder, you should be able to take out the micro SD card from the inside. I'm now going to take the soundboard and the SD card, add some fonts on it, and install the config file that my customer actually set up himself. I'll show you a little bit of that, but I won't be going into all of the details on the software side of things in this video in particular. To teach you guys how to set up the ProffieBoard on your computer, I'm going to give you links in the description. You're going to want to go to Frederick Hubb's website along with FET263. I'll also leave a link to the video made by Powell's Power Up, who goes over how to do all of that in great detail. For this video, I'm just going to show you me putting the sound fonts on the SD card and uploading the config to the ProffieBoard. And here you can see all the fonts my customer sent me to install on the Lightsaber, along with the config file that he made. Overall, this config is pretty good. I just had to make a couple adjustments to make it work perfectly. So now that we have the SD card and the config set up, we can plug this into the computer. Now we just have to upload it. And here are all the settings that I have on Arduino, and I'm just going to upload it straight to the ProffieBoard. Now that we have the entire ProffieBoard set up, we can test to see if it all works. Now that we have everything complete, the most fun but stressful part is to see if it actually works. So we just got to put the battery in place, negative to negative, positive to positive.
What have you become?
It works perfectly. Let's put it inside the hilt and see if we built the neck correctly. Okay, so I was testing it out and I discovered that when you put the pommel onto the lightsaber with the chassis and the hilt, it tends to spin the chassis ever so slightly so that the button doesn't get pressed properly by this. So what I did was I moved this button downward ever so slightly, and what I'm going to be doing is replacing one of the screws that holds this box in place with a slightly longer screw that sticks out and then guides along this chassis channel here. What that's going to do is it's going to prevent the chassis from turning as much, so when you screw in the pommel, it won't turn, and you can still be able to press these. I was lucky because I had this screw extra for my own personal Desert Wanderer build. This was from Sabers, while this is from Corbanth. Corbanth doesn't provide extra things like the longer screws or a blade plug diffuser here. So I just took this extra screw from my own Sabers version. That way I can make this work. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure where you would find one of these screws on your own. If you want one, you can probably contact Sabers at the Saber Armory, or maybe even Corbanth, and they might be able to tell you where they can find, or where you can find the screws. There you go. If you see inside a little bit, you can see it sticking out ever so slightly right back there. Now that we've tested the lightsaber and we know that everything works, there's one final thing left to do before I end off this video, and that's just to grease up all of the threads because they're not very good right now. And with that, I'd say this project is now complete. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I know it was super long, so it means a lot that you sat through it all. I tried my best to go over as much information as I could, and even though this video might have turned out a little messier than intended, I still think you should have enough information to get you started. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any additional info or better methods of installing that you prefer, please leave it down in the comments to help each other out. I hope you liked the video, and good luck with your lightsaber builds.
Master Kenobi?
I am, and when you have your strength, I will help you on your way.
Ben Kenobi?
Obi-Wan Kenobi. So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view. I'm Qui-Gon Jinn. At last we will have revenge. Count Dooku. I sense Count Dooku.
General Grievous, you're shorter than I expected.
Anakin Skywalker. Darth Vader. Where is he? What is it? Father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight.
This R2 has a bad motivator. Force to become a Jedi like my father. I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
Hello, Master. It's been a while.
Ahsoka Tano! Bo-Katan sent me. This party's over. General Krell, you're being relieved of duty.
Ezra Bridger.
Care to introduce your new friends, Caleb? I am Bastila Shan. I am Brianna, the last of the Jedi, and the one who will stand with you against all enemies who face us.
I have found the exile.
Darth Revan.
Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan! Master Kenobi, you disappoint me.